$18,400. That was the number on the invoice the funeral director slid across the table. My father, Walter Higgins. Gone 4 days now, though my body still hadn't caught up to that fact yet. I kept reaching for my phone to call him about small things, then remembering halfway through the motion. Marcus sat beside me. He didn't pick up the invoice, didn't even glance at it. "We're not paying that," he said. "Not to me, to the director, like I was furniture." "Marcus." My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "He's my father, and I'm the one who actually has a job." Loud enough now that the front row turned. "You've been playing nurse to a sick man for 3 years instead of working. What did you think was going to happen?" 40 people turned around in their seats. 40 people who'd known my father for decades watched my husband tell a room full of mourners that grief was a line item I should have budgeted for. What none of them knew, what I barely believed myself, was that 3 days earlier, a lawyer named Priscilla Ohm had called my cell phone and said 6 words that would end my marriage, end Marcus's career, and unravel everything he thought he understood about the quiet woman he'd married. If you're the kind of person who likes a story where the truth takes its time getting there but always arrives exactly when it's supposed to, stick with me. And if you want more like this one, subscribe, because what happens at the 30-minute mark is going to change how you look at every person you've ever underestimated. My name is Renata Higgins. Before any of this, I was a pediatric nurse, 14 years at St. Aldrich's Children's Hospital. It's the kind of job that teaches you to keep your face still no matter what's happening underneath it, and I was good at that. Good enough that the head of nursing tried twice to move me into administration. I said no both times. I liked the floor. I liked the kids. I liked being the person in the room who wasn't allowed to look scared. I should say, Marcus wasn't always the man from that funeral home. I need you to understand that because it matters for what comes later. I remember a Tuesday, maybe 6 years into the marriage, when I came home from a double shift and found him waiting up with soup he'd clearly burned the bottom of, and then tried to hide by transferring it to a different pot. He didn't say anything grand. He just handed me a bowl and said, "You look like you carried someone's whole day today." That was Marcus, once. Attentive in small, unglamorous ways. It's easier to hate a man who was always cruel. It's harder and truer to grieve one who used to be kind and slowly stopped. The change didn't happen all at once. Nothing that matters ever does. My father started forgetting things first. Small things, where he'd set his keys, what day of the week it was, the kind of slips you explain away because the alternative is too heavy to hold yet. By the time the diagnosis came, early onset vascular dementia, the doctor said, watching my face carefully as the words landed. My father had already gotten lost twice driving home from a grocery store he'd shopped at for 30 years. I want to be honest about what the next 3 years actually looked like, because people who haven't lived it tend to picture something gentle. Sitting by a bed, holding a hand, a kind of quiet dignity. Some of it was that. More of it was 3 a.m., finding him standing in the backyard in January without a coat, unable to explain why. More of it was learning to help a proud man bathe with whatever dignity I could still protect for him. More of it was mornings he didn't know my name, followed, somehow worse, by mornings he did, and I could see him hating himself for the mornings he hadn't. I quit my job in the 2nd year. No facility would take him without a 6-month wait list, and I wasn't going to spend his last clear years handing him to strangers on a schedule. Marcus said the right things in the beginning. Family comes first. We'll manage together. I believed him, because this was the same man who'd once driven 4 hours through a whiteout to sit with me the night my mother died. I didn't understand yet that a person can mean something completely and still stop meaning it in small increments until the man standing in front of you shares a face with the one you married and almost nothing else. He stopped inviting me to work dinners around year 2. When people asked about me, I became dealing with some family stuff. Technically true, engineered to sound like an excuse instead of what it was. His mother, Diane, took to commenting at holidays about how a husband shouldn't have to run a household alone. His sister Beth called me the unpaid babysitter once at a barbecue, loud enough for half the yard to hear, and Marcus laughed. Not a real laugh, the kind people do when they agree but don't want to be caught agreeing. I let it go. I remember standing at the sink that night, hands in dishwater gone cold. telling myself it didn't matter. My father was dying. I had already decided what mattered, and Marcus's comfort at a company picnic wasn't on the list. Then Vivian Cross arrived at Corrigan Vale Development, brought in as VP of Acquisitions to lead a merger with a rival firm. I only met her twice, both times briefly, and both times I came away with the same impression. She never raised her voice, never seemed rushed, and somehow still made every room reorganize itself around her without appearing to try. She wasn't cold. That was what made her dangerous. She was warm in a calculated way, the kind of warmth that makes you feel chosen right up until you realize it was strategy the whole time. Marcus's schedule started rearranging itself around her urgent evening calls. He started leaving his phone face down on the counter, which he'd never done before, not even during the affair he swore, years earlier, he'd never had. Her name showed up in conversation with the frequency of a habit he didn't seem to notice he'd picked up. I didn't confront him. My father had maybe 2 months left, and I wasn't going to spend them fighting over a marriage that was already burning quietly at the edges. Some things you carry in silence because what you're protecting matters more than what it costs you to protect it. My father died on a Thursday morning, my hand in his. He'd been unresponsive almost 2 full days. Then, in the last hour, the way some people do, he surfaced. Eyes clear, present, looking at me the way he hadn't looked at me in months. Ask Priscilla. His voice was barely there. Tell her, it's time. I thought it was the morphine talking. I told him I would, and kissed the back of his hand. Still rough from 40 years of yard work even then, and 20 minutes later, he was gone. I want to slow down here because this is the part that changed everything. The total came to $18,400. A modest service, a simple casket, a plot beside my mother, who'd been gone 8 years by then. I had $1,100 of my own. Everything else had gone into 3 years of care insurance only partially touched. I asked Marcus to cover the balance from our joint account. I asked him 3 times over 2 days. The first time, he said he'd look into it. The second time, he said work was insane right now. The third time, I found him in the bedroom pressing a suit for a merger dinner that same week, and without turning around, he said my father was gone, and the living had to think about the living. I stood in the doorway a long moment. I remember my hands. I hadn't noticed I'd been gripping the frame until my knuckles ached. I didn't say anything. There didn't seem to be anything left to say that hadn't already been answered. What happened at the funeral home the next morning, I will carry for the rest of my life. Not for the money. By then, the money had already become almost secondary. What I'll carry is the silence in a room full of my father's oldest friends, because my husband had just decided their grief was an inconvenience he didn't need to indulge. The director, a soft-spoken man named Otis Redman, found me as the service wound down and told me, as gently as the words allowed, that per policy, burial couldn't proceed until the balance was settled. I found Marcus in the 3rd row, thumb moving over his phone with the particular ease of someone who was somewhere else entirely. I handed him the invoice without a word. He looked at it. Then he laughed. Not quietly, not to himself, but pitched, performed, aimed at an audience. He asked, loud enough for 2 rows to hear, whether I seriously expected him to spend $18,000 on someone who's already gone anyway. His mother stepped up behind him, one hand on his shoulder, and said a man who'd been the only income for 3 years had no room to play the martyr. Beth, seated just behind them, added that I should have married someone who could actually do the math on what he was carrying. A few people near me looked at the floor. A few others gave me the specific, helpless look people wear when they're witnessing something they wish they could stop but have no standing to. Marcus dropped the invoice on the empty seat beside him and left with his mother and sister. The burial was postponed. That night, I sat on the hallway floor outside our bedroom and listened to him on the phone. Vivian. He was laughing, that easy, private laugh he used to save for me once a long time ago. He told her everything was handled, that I wouldn't cause real trouble, because I had nothing. No job, no income, nowhere to go. There was a settled certainty in his voice. The ease of a man who's already decided how a story ends and is only waiting for reality to catch up. I didn't cry that night, which I think surprised me more than it would surprise you. I sat very still in the dark and thought about my father's last words. Ask Priscilla. Tell her it's time. I found her card the next morning, tucked in the back of my father's old leather address book. Priscilla Ohm, Estate and Trust Counsel, a downtown exchange, the kind of number that belongs to an office that's handled quietly important things for a very long time. Priscilla's office sat on the 11th floor of a building that had been dignified before dignified went out of fashion. Brass fixtures, a receptionist who still kept a paper appointment log. When I gave my name, she didn't check the book. She said Ms. Ohm had been expecting someone from the Higgins family and walked me straight back. That was the first moment I understood that whatever I was walking into had been waiting for me long before I knew it existed. Priscilla was in her 60s with the kind of stillness that isn't emptiness but discipline. Someone who'd learned, over decades, that saying things too quickly wastes what they're worth. She told me she was sorry about my father. Then she told me plainly not to sign anything. Not a form, not a transfer, nothing touching the house or Corrigan Vale or Marcus. Not yet, she said. Let me finish. She explained that estate work like this required precision, not speed, that she'd already spent 9 days confirming what she suspected before I ever walked through her door, and she needed more time to be certain before laying it out properly. In the meantime, she said gently, I needed to bury my father first. She was right about the order of things, even if I didn't want to hear it that morning. I spent the following days selling what I had left to sell. My mother's jewelry went to a buyer downtown who barely looked at it before naming a number. The second car we rarely used went for less than I hoped. A set of my father's old tools went to a contractor 2 towns over for $400 less than they were worth, and I didn't have it in me to argue. When I brought what I'd raised to Otis Redman, he looked at the total for a long moment. Long enough that I braced myself for him to say it wasn't sufficient, and then wrote paid in full across the invoice without another word. I've thought about that gesture more times than I can count since. Some people understand exactly what it costs a person to come up short and choose grace over policy without ever needing credit for it. My father was buried on a Monday, in the rain, beside my mother. 9 people stayed to the end. Marcus wasn't one of them. He'd sent a text that morning about obligations affecting the whole regional team. I read it standing under a borrowed umbrella and understood it completely, just not the way he meant for me to. I gave myself 1 night alone in his house before going back to Priscilla. I sat in his recliner, the one still shaped like him, and let myself come apart quietly without an audience, for the first time in 3 years. In the morning, standing in front of my parents' wedding photo, my father's tie slightly crooked, my mother laughing at something outside the frame, I decided I was going to find out exactly what 9 days of confirmation had turned up, and what the little brass key in his nightstand actually opened. Here's a memory I want to give you, because I think you'll need it later. When I was 9, my father took me to St. Aldrich's for a broken wrist. I remember being terrified of the waiting room, the smell of it, the fluorescent hum. He knelt down to my height. I remember his knees cracking, the sound of it, and said, "This place fixes people, Ran. That's all it does. It just fixes people." I didn't think about that memory again for over 20 years. I think about it constantly now. The key belonged to a drawer in an old drafting table that had sat, forgotten, in a storage annex behind St. Aldrich's for over a decade. The same hospital I'd worked at for 14 years, walked past that annex 100 times without ever knowing what it held. Inside the drawer, a folder of share certificates, a trust instrument thick with legal language I had to read twice to follow, and a letter in my father's handwriting. I didn't read the letter there. I folded it into my coat pocket, the same pocket that had carried the funeral invoice 4 days earlier, and took it home. That night, Priscilla called. What she'd found turned everything from painful to criminal, and she said so carefully, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis they've triple-checked. 8 months before my father's condition worsened. Back when his hands still shook too badly to hold a spoon steady, let alone sign anything with confidence. A $310,000 loan had been taken out against his house. The signature on the paperwork was his. It was also, Priscilla said, too clean, too consistent stroke for stroke, for a man whose fine motor control had been failing for 2 years. She'd had it compared against 3 verified samples from that same period. It didn't match any of them. The funds had moved to a shell entity registered to an assistant working under Vivian Cross. part of that money had then funded Vivian's personal equity position in the very merger she was, at that moment, overseeing. They had used my dying father's house, the house my parents raised me in, to help fund the deal that was about to make my husband's mistress a wealthy woman. I asked Priscilla to file the ownership claim the moment her office opened. Then I sat with my father's letter until I'd read every line of it twice. Here's the second memory. Short, I promise. The day I got my nursing license, my father drove 40 minutes just to take a photo of me in front of the hospital sign. In scrubs I hadn't broken in yet. He didn't say much. He just kept looking at the picture on his phone the whole drive home, smiling at it like it was the only thing in the world worth looking at. My father's letter explained, in his own plain, unhurried way, why he'd kept the secret for over 30 years. In 1991, St. Aldrich's had been 2 months from closing its doors permanently. A failed capital campaign, a funding source that collapsed overnight, a board out of options. My father, an engineer by trade with no background in hospital finance, had quietly mortgaged everything he and my mother owned and brought in 4 private investors he trusted personally to keep the doors open. In exchange, through a holding trust his own attorney structured, named Alder House after my grandmother, he received 58% controlling ownership. He never sat on the board. Priscilla explained why. The original trust agreement, drafted specifically at his request, barred the controlling family from operational involvement for exactly this reason, so that no employee, including eventually his own daughter, would ever be treated differently because of who controlled the paperwork upstairs. The hospital's leadership at the time knew only that a silent benefactor had saved the institution. Over 3 decades, as boards turned over and administrations changed, that benefactor became a rumor, then a footnote, then nothing anyone thought to mention at all, which was, Priscilla said, exactly how my father wanted it. He wrote that he'd watched me choose, again and again, to be the person who sits beside someone in their hardest moment rather than the person chasing a title, and that he'd wanted me to grow into that fully, without money changing how anyone around me, including me, understood my own worth. At the bottom of the last page, in the same careful hand that had written 30 years of engineering notes, was the line I would later have framed. Don't answer cruelty with cruelty. Answer it with the truth. Upon his death, ownership transferred to me under the trust succession clause. Automatic, Priscilla explained, requiring only formal claim within 30 days to avoid the shares redistributing among the hospital's current executive board. A board that had, over the past year, added 2 new advisory seats, filled, at Vivian's recommendation, by representatives from Corrigan Vale Development, in anticipation of the land agreement now 3 weeks from signing. My father had been gone 19 days. I had 11 left. I need to slow down once more here, because this is the part one put off the longest. Priscilla had obtained, through entirely proper legal channels tied to the fraud claim, a forensic copy of the message thread between Marcus and Vivian. I read it at her desk on a gray Tuesday afternoon, traffic moving 14 floors below. No sound in the room except the occasional turn of her pen against a legal pad. The early messages were what I expected. I won't repeat them. By that point, the marriage had already ended in every way that mattered. I was only waiting for paperwork to formalize what the funeral home had already made public. What I wasn't prepared for came later. Marcus had told Vivian, in writing, that I wouldn't look closely at any financial documents for at least a month after my father's death. He described me as someone who disappears into grief, who trusts too easily, who won't think to question anything moving around her. And then the line that made 3 weeks of confusion collapse into one clear picture. Let her drown in the funeral and the debt. By the time she looks up, we'll already own the board. I read it once, then I read it again, slower, like I might find a version of it that meant something else. I didn't. The refusal at the funeral home hadn't been coldness. It had been strategy. He'd needed me buried in logistics and grief and the specific, exhausting helplessness of a woman who can't afford to bury her own father. Needed me looking down, not up, not anywhere near whatever was quietly moving through the hospital's paperwork while I was too tired to notice. He hadn't known for certain that I was the Alder heir, but he'd known I might be, and he'd been willing to use my father's funeral as a mechanism to run out my clock before I found out. Sitting with that was a different kind of grief than the one I'd carried at the graveside. It was the grief of understanding that a person you loved had measured the exact depth of your pain and decided it was useful. I told Priscilla to make sure everything was in order. Then I went home and pressed the navy dress I'd worn to my mother's funeral 8 years earlier, because it was the only thing left in my closet that still felt like me. The hospital's 30th anniversary gala was held in St. Aldrich's main atrium. The original wing, high windows, a wall of photographs documenting 30 years of patients who'd walked out healthy. Over 200 people filled the room. Physicians, donors, board members, and the Corrigan Vale executives who'd flown in to close the land agreement. At the front sat a table with 2 chairs, 2 pens, and a contract a great many people had spent the last year working toward. Vivian wore the dress she'd been fitting the same week she told Marcus, in writing, to let me drown. She looked exactly the way she'd planned, composed, arrived, the kind of woman who belongs wherever she happens to be standing. Marcus stood beside her with the ease of a man who'd already decided how the evening would end. She crossed to me within 30 seconds. Voice low, expression perfectly controlled. The same calm I'd seen her use on colleagues who never seemed to notice they'd been managed. She asked, evenly, who'd arranged my invitation and reminded me, in the tone people use when they want to sound reasonable while making a threat, that if I made the evening difficult, the divorce filing would reflect my instability. I told her the hospital's controlling shareholder had invited me, and that she should pay very close attention to the next 20 minutes. At 8 o'clock, board chairman Dr. Harold Weiss stepped to the podium. He'd known my father almost 30 years, in the way people know a quiet man they respect without fully understanding why. He announced the signing would be briefly delayed. The hospital's controlling shareholder had exercised the right to address the room. Then he told the story of 1991, the near closure, the engineer who'd arrived with his own savings and a handful of trusted investors, and refused to let a children's hospital shut its doors. He said that man had asked for nothing in return but the quiet assurance that what he'd saved would continue. He said the man's name was Walter Higgins, and that for over 30 years, the family had honored that arrangement without once asking for recognition. Then he turned toward the back of the room and asked me to come forward. I thought a great deal about what I felt walking through that crowd. 200 people turning to look at a woman half of them had never once noticed, despite 14 years of my walking those same halls in scrubs. My hands were shaking, just slightly, and I remember pressing them flat against my dress to still them before I reached the podium. What I felt wasn't triumph. It was quieter than that, the particular clarity of someone who spent a long time seeing things other people insisted weren't there, finally handed a room in which to say so out loud. I confirmed I held 58% of the hospital through Alder House Trust, and that I wasn't approving the land agreement as written. Then I said there was something the room deserved to understand first, not to settle a private account, but because they were about to put their names on something built on rot. I kept it short. The invoice, the 3 requests, the room full of my father's mourners who heard my husband announce he wouldn't spend $18,000 on someone already gone. I told them I'd sold my mother's jewelry and my father's tools to bury him. The same week Corrigan Vale had quietly moved $300,000 out of his mortgaged house. Vivian moved toward the podium, composure fully recalibrated in the space of a breath, and said, calmly, reasonably, that this was a private matter, that I was using a shareholder position to relitigate a marriage dispute in front of colleagues, that the room wasn't the appropriate venue for personal grievances. A few people nodded, slightly. For a moment it was working. That was the thing about Vivian, even caught. She sounded like the only sane person in the room. I looked at her directly, for the first time all evening, and said, "You made that choice in front of 9 people who came to say goodbye to my father. I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm here because everyone in this room is about to sign their name to something they don't fully understand, and they have a right to know what it's standing on." Then I laid out the loan. $310,000 against a dying man's house, 8 months before he died. A signature that didn't match anything he'd written in the 2 years prior. I explained where the money went, the shell entity, her assistant, her own equity position in tonight's deal. Priscilla stood near the side wall with the complete documentation, and I said so plainly so no one mistook this for accusation without proof. Marcus turned to Vivian and started something about financing structure, about whose decision it had originally been. Vivian turned to Marcus, calm as ever, and said the entire strategy had come from him, that she'd simply acted on professional advice, that she hadn't known where the funds originated. They went back and forth like that for several seconds while the room watched in a silence I could feel in my chest. I didn't intervene. I just read the message aloud, the one line about letting me drown in the funeral and the debt until the board was already theirs. I read it once, set the paper down, and said nothing else. The room understood. Not the full legal architecture of it, that would take months to untangle properly. But they understood, the way people understand things said plainly in front of witnesses, that the woman about to help lead this hospital's next chapter had used a dying man's final weeks as a tool. When Marcus asked, quietly, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear, for a chance to explain, I reached into my coat and set his own divorce filing on the table in front of him. The one drafted 2 weeks earlier, describing me as financially dependent, professionally inactive, and contributing nothing of value to the marriage. I told him he'd been right about one thing. The marriage was over. The difference was that I no longer needed his permission to decide when. What followed took months to fully resolve. The land deal was suspended, then abandoned. An investigation opened into the forged loan and the shell transfer. Vivian moved quickly to cooperate with investigators. Calmly, methodically, the same way she did everything. Marcus moved just as quickly to frame her cooperation as self-serving. The message thread and the financial records told a story neither of them could dismantle by pointing at the other, and eventually they both stopped trying. Marcus lost his position at Corrigan Vale within the year, not from the fraud investigation directly, which Priscilla kept carefully separate from our divorce, but because no board wants a regional director whose personal conduct becomes the headline attached to the company's name. I didn't attend most of the proceedings. I'd already seen what I needed to see. The night Dr. Weiss said my father's name out loud in a room where I was finally present to hear it. I went back to St. Aldrich's, not behind a desk on an executive floor, but with my father's old drafting table moved up from the storage annex and placed in a glass-walled office just off the main pediatric corridor, where any nurse or parent walking past could see it. He'd have hated an office that hid from the people the hospital actually served. One more memory, and then I'll let this rest. Marcus had looked at me in that funeral home and seen a woman with nothing left. In a way, he wasn't wrong. That day, I had almost nothing. What he couldn't have accounted for was that my father had built something specific for that exact moment. Hidden precisely so the people around me would show me who they really were before they ever knew what was waiting on the other side of it. He wanted me to see clearly. I finally did. Stories like this stay with people because they remind us of something easy to forget, that the ones who quietly step back from ambition to sit beside someone they love aren't weak. They're often carrying more weight, in more silence, than anyone around them ever gives them credit for. If this one moved you, share it with someone who needs it today. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because every week, we bring you stories about ordinary people who turned the moment everyone counted them out into the moment everything changed. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Marcus had looked at me in that funeral home and seen a woman with nothing left. In a way, he wasn't wrong. That day, I had almost nothing. What he couldn't have accounted for was that my father had built something specific for that exact moment. Hidden precisely so the people around me would show me who they really were before they ever knew what was waiting on the other side of it. He wanted me to see clearly. I finally did. Stories like this stay with people because they remind us of something easy to forget, that the ones who quietly step back from ambition to sit beside someone they love aren't weak. They're often carrying more weight, in more silence, than anyone around them ever gives them credit for. If this one moved you, share it with someone who needs it today. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because every week, we bring you stories about ordinary people who turned the moment everyone counted them out into the moment everything changed. You don't want to miss what's coming next.